This is The Lonely Voice with Peter Orner on Book Public from Texas Public Radio. I'm Yvette Benavides. On this episode of The Lonely Voice, Peter Orner and I discuss Ivy Day in the Committee Room by James Joyce. This is an Election Day story based on the 11th anniversary of the death of Charles Parnell. He was a nationalist and largely known as the uncrowned King of Ireland. He was a brilliant organizer and leader, but a scandalous affair with a married woman caused his fall from grace. In the story, canvassers come in from the cold and gather in the committee room for the new campaign they support, if half-heartedly. They're nostalgic for a past that seems brighter and lighter compared to the current prospects before them in the pending election. The sensory imagery of the story, along with the complex and profound ideas told in such accessible and humorous ways, make the story a favorite among Joyce's works. Here now, Peter Orner and I discuss Ivy Day in the Committee Room by James Joyce.
What I love about this story is how visual it is. It opens with a guy in a campaign committee room where people can like a campaign headquarters in Dublin during a municipal election for the city council. They call it the corporation, and basically it involves people who are canvassing for a certain candidate who are coming in out of the cold and the rain to warm up by the fire and have a beer and talk. And this story captures guys talking about politics in such a joyful, comic, and completely sorrowful way too, that it's like nothing else I know.
This is true. At first, when you first read the story, it's like there are so many characters to keep track of, but their personalities are so defined that you can keep them straight. And you're right, they're all sitting around talking. It is funny, and it is also enlightening about so many different heavy things, including social issues, morality, youth culture in Ireland at that time, as we learn about old Jack's son. I mean, there's layer upon layer of
Old Jack's ne'er-do-well son.
ne'er-do-well, no account boy. But there's layer upon layer of insight. You don't need to read the footnotes, right? I mean, it's just like if you just keep reading.
No, you don't. And you don't need to, I counted 9 characters. Jack, O'Connor, Hines, Henchy, Turney, who's not in the story, Colgan, who's not in the story because they're the candidates, Crofton and Lyons. Everyone but Jack is a canvasser. They've been out campaigning. They have now come in, except for Hines, who's sort of the pivotal character who comes in at the end and reads the poem. But it's really about guys just talking trash, talking smack. There isn't, I'm wary of getting a lot of morality about this, taking from this story a lot of morality. I think the point of the story in some ways is that there's very, very little morality involved in politics.
I feel like they just take it in stride. Like at this point, even though they glorify the past and Parnell, it feels in moments, they're not all in with that, but it feels in moments like that's just something to do when you look in front of you and everything looks so terrible. I mean, we say this in 2022. Was it always this bad? How did it get this bad? It's never been as bad as this.
Right.
And
didn't we say that during times of the Gulf War? Didn't we say that during the times of Monica with Clinton? Didn't we say this, et cetera, et cetera? We've always said it, but I think that with the caveat that it does feel now that the breakdown is hard to comprehend, and that's another reason why I went back to this story, because I wanted a more human discussion, human story about politics. These are individual guys trying to make a buck. They criticize the opposition, but not in a way that we see today. Nothing like it. There's something, it's not civil necessarily. It's just down and dirty.
And it's also not naive or innocent.
No.
It still feels like all of these guys have experienced a lot. they have a lot of fears and worries somewhere in there. I mean, they do talk about the economy, they do talk about jobs, they do talk about, the Labor Party, they do talk about the no account son. They, they talk about a lot of different things that um, show how informed they are about the issues. And yet, tricky Dicky Tierney is really not their guy.
Well, but he is their guy. They're out there campaigning for him. Why is he their guy? Because he's paying them. But you can tell exactly that he's not their guy, like you say. In the very first page of the story, O'Connor takes a cigarette out of his mouth, and what does he use to light the cigarette is one of the a piece of campaign literature of Tierney. That's what he uses. He does it twice. He burns it up. That's what he cares. That's how much he cares about the guy he's canvassing for. Except there is a turning point when Tierney does deliver on sending the booze in, and then they're like, "Oh, Tierney's not such a bad guy." Right? It's hilarious. It's hilarious.
And old Jack's giving a bottle to the 17-year-old kid.
Yeah, and then he says what? He says to him, "That's how it starts." Like, you're the one who just gave it to him.
What's the other line? The thin end of the wedge.
Yes, yes. But there's so much, even just to a point of like early on in the story, Mr. O'Connor had been engaged by Mr. Tierney's agent to canvass one part of the ward, but as the weather was inclement and his boots let in the wet, he spent a great part of the day sitting by the fire in the committee room in Wicklow Street with Jack, the old caretaker. They'd been sitting thus since the short day had grown dark. It was the 6th of October, dismal and cold out of doors. So he's not been out canvassing, O'Connor. He's been inside getting warm. And then there's a moment where Mr. Hinchy comes in, and the description of Mr. Hinchy having cold ears is one of the great lines that I can think of Joyce. The line is, "Then a bustling little man with a snuffling nose and very cold ears pushed in the door." It's just because he's been out working. He's been out getting votes for Tierney.
It says, Mr. Hines laughed and, shoving himself away from the mantelpiece with the aid of his shoulders, made ready to. Those lines like that, I just have to go back and reread 3 or 4 times. But
no, I did that in my room today. I leaned against the wall and pushed off with my shoulders just to kind of see what that, like how you would describe that. And it's something we do, right? We do push ourselves off the wall with our shoulders, but how often do we see it described? So that's part of the thing is like, Joyce. I mean, Joyce rants about Parnell in every book. In Ulysses, there are rants about Parnell, and in this story, there's rants about Parnell, and other stories in Dubliners, there's rants about Parnell. Joyce loved Parnell. He thought that the country had betrayed this man by turning on him because he was involved in that scandal. But again, I think it's the small touches of this story that, and really all of Joyce, that makes him great, and not the way that he sends us to our dictionaries, our encyclopedias, or Google or whatever. I mean, he himself said, I'm going to keep the professors busy for 1,000 years. And, that was a joke, but some people don't get it. There's some writers who create life on the page like nothing else. And, if you're too busy trying to piece together who Tierney was, apparently this editor really cares. He ultimately concludes there was no Tierney. Of course, there's no Tierney. This is fiction, you idiot. But apparently, a lot of the other names are true. So, and he loved to do that. He loved to mess with us. He loved to put in fictional characters and real characters interacting together because he's a fiction writer. Everybody.
So, Parnell is dead and does not appear as a living person, and he's so alive in the story. At least, I mean, to a certain point, it almost seems like, in comparison, all of these poor guys that are sitting around coming in from the cold and drinking, I almost feel like Parnell is like the light in the space, even though I feel like it's sort of the light of their nostalgia. And
yeah, I mean, I think it's the light of their nostalgia. I mean, it's not really about him, although you could argue that Hines is a true believer. But Henchy is the one who mentions him late in the story. Henchy says, "Parnell," said Mr. Henchy, "is dead." Now here's the way to look at it. And then their argument has to do with whether or not it's okay for the King of England to come to Ireland and for them to how they should react. And I guess Parnell, in context that Irish readers would know, wasn't going to have the King of England come. And if the King of England came, he wasn't going to acknowledge him. And he asked that his supporters ignore the king. But times have changed, and Henchy is saying, look, now here's a way to look at it. Here's this chap come to throne after his old mother keeping him out of it till the man was gray. He's a man of the world and means well by us. He's a jolly fine, decent fellow, if you ask me, and no damn nonsense about him. He just says to himself, the old one never went to see these wild Irish. By Christ, I'll go myself and see what they're like. So he's actually going against Parnell's, saying, hey, no, don't acknowledge the king. And, we're talking about Ireland here and the king, right? So Henchy is all over this. But then the story turns because Henchy himself starts to kind of get misty-eyed for Parnell. And then he starts giving speeches about how great Parnell was, the same character.
Takes off his hat and the whole thing.
Yes, and he says, he's the one who, like you quoted earlier, he's the one who, die down, dogs, lie down, you curs. Or maybe I heard that myself earlier. But anyway, he said, he says, you are right, Crofton, said Mr. Henchy fiercely. He was the only man that could keep that bag of cats in order. The same guy who he just said is dead. We got to move on. And that, to me, is such a beautiful example of how people and characters aren't consistent. I mean, this is one page later, he's celebrating Parnell after he said, look, he's dead, we got to move on. I get a little excited about this story.
No.
Sorry. There's nothing more imperfect than an election. I think tragically, people don't understand that as much as maybe they used to. These guys knew, this is a negotiation, right? Mm-hmm. We know Tierney's not our guy, but actually Tierney is our guy because he's the guy at the moment. He's the guy that's paying us. And, presumably Henchy actually kind of believes in Tierney. He's like, Tierney understands that the king's going to bring in money and that's what we need. And so the nationalists are not the nationalists of old. They're the nationalists of now. And so he's practical, I think. Mm-hmm. And that seems to be, the kind of real politic that is sort of getting lost.
Well, it is interesting that the man in this committee room talk about all of the different ways of looking at the politics. So they talk about Colgan, a working man, and there's this explanation about what's the difference between a good, honest bricklayer and a publican, eh? Hasn't the working man as good a right to be in the corporation as anyone else? And a better right than those shonines that are always hat in hand before any fellow with a handle to his name? And so that, they're able to bring in a lot of context to us, whether we look it up or not. We do understand that they're informed up to a point. They've convinced themselves of why one candidate won't work out in the current situation that they're in, or based on whatever else is going on with them.
It's so important. It's Hines that says that, because Hines is the only character in the story, really, that is sort of non-aligned, which makes him suspicious, right? Mm-hmm. Hines, and I think that I'm sure that scholars have said this, but I mean, it's clearly the Joyce character. He was sort of famously hard to pin down politically. He didn't have any real, you couldn't really track him. And I think he's somebody who he loved Parnell, that we know. But in general, he didn't always wade into this in a way that maybe people would have wanted to, or the scholars may want to track. Like he's so good at representing every point of view possible that I think he's hard to pin down. But the character in this story that kind of stands a little bit apart is Hines, and he's the one who says, "Hey, look, why don't you think about the other guy, the guy that Tierney's running against, because he's actually comes from the working classes." And they're like, wait, so what are you talking about? It's like, and he's like, yeah, I'm just saying it, right? And then O'Connor's like, when he leaves, and Hinchy says, so what's that guy doing hanging around here? Why is he here? Because he's suspicious. He's not a canvasser. He's just some guy off the street that they know. He's not working for Tierney. So what's he doing in the story? He's the person who is not the political actor here. He's the poet who gives the poem at the end of the story, which is think of a bunch of five guys drinking around drinking on a cold day in October. The last thing they're going to do is want to hear a poem, but that's what they do in this story, and they love it. They love this poem.
Well, before we get to back to the poem, I do have to ask you a very important question, and it is about Puck. I think it's about the apologetic Puck, the pop of the bottle.
Oh, right. The apologetic pop. Yes.
It's the POK in the story that occurs in very interesting moments in the story, I think. Again, it's hilarious.
It's hilarious, and it's also beautiful, and it's also hearable. Like, it's not, if you think of this pop, it's not the pop of a champagne bottle. It's just a little pop, right? And a little like better. Your pop was better. My pop was a little more too enthusiastic. But it's almost like, to call that apologetic is, again, one of these things that, and Joyce he's not perfect. There's some ridiculous things in Ulysses, and misogyny all over the place, and
Yeah.
a million things. Racism definitely in Ulysses, but there's something about his use of language that is so extraordinary, and that he would hear that pop as apologetic is just one example.
This poem that everybody loves. Does everybody love the poem
I mean,
in the moment?
it's a cheesy poem, but it's one of these. I mean, Hines is not a great artist. I mean, I said Hines is the Joyce character, but it's as if Joyce wasn't a good poet, right? And he wasn't a very good poet anyway. But it's kind of a it's a over the top celebration of a man that, again, who was imperfect and had a downfall because people turned on him because of this, Kitty O'Shea. He had an affair with Kitty O'Shea. She was married. Her husband got upset. It was in the divorce papers that he was having this affair, and it brought him down. And it brought out the knives, and it brought out the hypocrites. Probably plenty of people who helped bring down Parnell were having affairs.
Yes. And I do appreciate the little paragraph before the poem where Hines is hesitating and he takes off his hat and he's kind of rehearsing in his
Yes.
mind.
Yeah, why don't you read that? Why don't you read that exchange? Because it's so great.
Mr. Hines did not seem to remember at once the piece to which they were alluding, but after reflecting a while, he said, "Oh, that thing, is it? Sure, that's old now. Out with it, man," said Mr. O'Connor. "Shh," said Mr. Henchy. "Now, Joe." Mr. Hines hesitated a little longer. Then, amid the silence, he took off his hat, laid it on the table, and stood up. He seemed to be rehearsing the piece in his mind. After a rather long pause, he announced,
He cleared his throat once or twice and then began to recite. He cleared his throat once or twice. Is also great. He is dead. Our uncrowned king is dead. O Aaron, mourn with grief and woe, for he lies dead, whom the fell gang of modern hypocrites laid low. He lies slain by the coward hounds he raised to glory from the mire, and Erin's hopes and Erin's dreams perish upon her monarch's pyre. In palace cabin or in cot, the Irish heart, wherever it be, is bowed with woe, for he is gone. Who would have wrought her destiny? He would have had his Erin famed, the green flag gloriously unfurled, her statesmen, bards, and warriors raised before the nations of the world. He dreamed, alas, 'twas it but a dream, of liberty. But as he strove to clutch that idol, treachery sundered him from the thing he loved. Shame on the coward caitiff hands that smote their lord, or with a kiss betrayed him to the rabble rout of fawning priests, no friends of his. It goes on. It goes on. The death of Parnell, 6th of October, 1891. And remember, it's the 6th of October, so it's the anniversary of Parnell's death. And to honor Parnell's death, they wear ivy in their lapels, because that was what people, the mourners in the cemetery, the famous cemetery that he's born in Dublin, they took it's Glasnevin Cemetery. It had ivy growing, and so they just picked the ivy and they put it in their lapels, and that became a tradition on his death day. So what's interesting is that at least two of the guys are wearing ivy, and so that they're, clearly O'Connor and Hines are celebrators of Parnell. Maybe not so much the others, including Crofton, who's a conservative, but he's canvassing because his conservative candidate dropped out, so he's supporting the nationalist ticket. But even Crofton, it's Crofton that gets the very famous last line of the story, where Hinchy says to him, "What do you think of that poem, Crofton?" cried Mr. Hinchy. "Isn't that fine?" "What?" And then it's a line of indirect dialogue. Mr. Crofton said it was a very fine piece of writing, which it's not. But even Crofton will respect the dead. But I mean, he probably had knives out for Parnell when he was alive. It's like when Bill Clinton dies. Are the people who is Newt Gingrich going to say something nice about him for 5 seconds? Maybe, right? That's what we do.
But it has to be indirect like this, I think.
Yeah.
This kind of flat sentence.
Right. He was quite a talented campaigner. But I think the story really hinges on this idea, as you said, about nostalgia and about political nostalgia in particular. And I think we all have it. I mean, think how we talk about, in 2008 when Obama gave his acceptance speech that night when he won the election, in Chicago to that crowd, what that was like. And I remember the night Clinton won, and and he's in Little Rock with Al Gore on the stage, and maybe I'm giving too much away about my politics, but there are these moments in our lives when we look back to them with, definitely rose-colored tints. And, those years weren't perfect either, but this is a great example of people of all stripes looking back on that and saying, wow, those were days, That's what this story's about. It's about looking back, and at a time when we now pretend now that there was unity back then.
James Joyce is the author of Ivy Day in the Committee Room. It can be found in the collection Dubliners. Peter Orner is the author of the new essay collection titled Still No Word from You, Notes in the Margin. His previous essay collection is Am I Alone Here? Notes on Living to Read and Reading to Live. He's also the author of 2 novels and 3 story collections, including Maggie Brown and Others. Peter Orner is the Director of Creative Writing at Dartmouth College. This has been The Lonely Voice with Peter Orner on Book Public from Texas Public Radio. Write to us at bookpublic@tpr.org. Jacob Rosati composed our theme music. Dan Katz is Texas Public Radio's news director. We had help this week from David Martin Davies. I'm Yvette Benavides.